Hi everyone, as Ahmed has introduced, I'm Valerie, the Innovation Associate at Good Food Institute Asia Pacific. So just a bit of introduction about Good Food Institute Asia Pacific. We're headquartered in Singapore, and we, in short form, we're GFI APAC, and we're Asia's leading alternative protein think tank, trying to accelerate a shift away from industrial animal agriculture through open access, food science, research and development, corporate engagement, and policy advocacy. So I'll move on now to having a round of introductions for each speaker. So let's have each speaker introduce yourself and your company, and tell us about what your company is working on using cell culture technology. Maybe we can start with Mihir.
Sure, thanks Valerie. Hello everyone, my name is Mihir Pershad. I'm CEO and founder of Umami Meats. We're a Singapore-based company that's cultivating not caught seafood. So we're basically producing sustainable seafood via cultivation rather than catching it or farming it from the oceans. And we're prioritizing species that are difficult to farm and are already endangered or threatened globally, with a particular focus on the species that are loved in Asia Pacific, starting with Japanese eel, among others.
Cool. Now let's go on to Luis.
Thank you, Valerie. My name is Luis Fernando Malaver. I am co-founder of Malaver-Ortega, a new biotechnological company founded in Australia. Our main goal, ultimate goal, is to create a human breast milk-based fortifiers for vulnerable babies. A little bit about me, I have a PhD in cellular molecular biology from Monash University, and for many, many years I've been training with CSIRO, University of Queensland, Monash University, MIMR, and the Hodgson Institute of Medical Research here in Australia. And with Isha Sashina, the co-founder, we decided to establish the company last year, and we have been successful in raising enough money to get things up and running.
Thank you, Luis. And now let's have Ziliang introduce himself.
Hi everyone, this is Ziliang Yang. I'm the co-founder and CEO of CellX. We are the leading cellular agriculture company based in Shanghai, China. We started in 2020. We have so far we have a team of 30, and we have just raised our Series A. So really making lots of progress in the field of cellular agriculture based in China. And for my background, in my past life, I used to be, I used to work at BCG as a management consultant, and I have been a flexitarian for the past 7 years. So really hoping to change the way how media is being produced and also consumed around the world. And that's why I started CellX about 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you everyone for your introductions. You all have definitely very impressive backgrounds. So now I'm going to have a few individual questions for each panelist. So I'll start off with Mihir. Within the APAC region, Singapore has become a clear leader in the CellX field, particularly when it comes to government interests and investments. So I'm curious to know, what are your specific reasons for why you set up Umami Meats in Singapore? What were your considerations at the time, and how is the support for early stage startups in Singapore?
Sure. Yeah, I think we made a bet on Singapore early because we founded the company in Singapore in February of 2020, which was based on a couple of things. First was Singapore's government had already expressed strong interest in becoming a leader for novel foods technologies with the 30 by 30 framework and the investment that accompanied it. That was also paired with, I think, strong sentiment coming from Enterprise Singapore and others that Singapore intended to become the first country in the world to approve cultivated meat for commercial sale, and that the regulatory institutions were already working towards that goal. So those two key pieces were essential in our decision-making process, because we wanted to make sure that we were setting up in an environment where we could also be successful launching our first products. So we wanted to make sure that we were in an environment where the regulatory support, as well as the ecosystem, was broadly supportive of what we were working on. And I think the last major decision point for us was that we're working on seafood, and we wanted to be based in Asia, because the vast majority of seafood demand is going to be within Asia Pacific in the coming decades, more so than it already is. And so that combination of factors made Singapore a pretty obvious choice once we sat down and looked at the different factors we were comparing.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I do think that Singapore is definitely a hub for cultivated meat, especially because it is the first country to approve the public sale of cultivated meat as well. So my next question is for Louis. How did your team first get into cell cultured dairy? Why did you choose to focus on that? And have there been advantages basing your startup and team in Australia?
Okay, so our history as founders is a funny one. We have a strong base for our company that is basically founded in my expertise in terms of technical knowledge that is required, and also my co-founder and partner Isha Sashina understanding of the economics and the commercial implications of launching this kind of products. And being close to the field of cellular agriculture for many years, my PhD was generating stem cells from cattle, from bovine tissues, and those are actually part of the funding technologies that create Medable, one of the biggest companies at the moment creating clean meat based in the Netherlands. So I've been always close to the space, but running my academic career in parallel. But since I met Isha and we found the need to come with new products, especially for a vulnerable population like the preterm babies, we definitely identify these cell-based technologies as the best way to produce these very sophisticated products. We look at ourselves beyond dairy products, and we are trying to recreate a very complex product, which is human breast milk. And we all understand the different aspect of human milk, how it is important for support, for nutrition, but also how teach the baby and how much communicate to the baby of all these different cues that is coming from the environment. And it's a very difficult product to recreate. And that's why we use cell-based technology that is able to capture all that process, and it gives you the opportunity to escalate that process in order to establish an industrial pipeline. Now, in terms of the advantage of being in Australia, obviously Australia has many of the high-profile research institutions in the world. Australia has been always well known by the quality of their researchers, and also especially people working in the field of stem cells. And Australia also offers a particularity, and is that there is a big community of researchers, but it's quite centralized. So there is a lot of collaboration, and there is a lot of different networks that we are utilizing in order to leverage all this knowledge and all these new technologies to develop our products.
Great, thank you for your answer. And I noticed that there has been a boom in the CellX ecosystem in Australia with many new startups emerging. What do you think has led to this surge of new companies and the interest in this field in Australia?
Look, everyone is more conscious about the impact on the environment of our food production system, and we are not a part of the movement that is around the world. There is more a concern about how we can find cleanest ways to produce and face the growing requirements for the industry. And Australia has been always very strong in terms of biotechnological developments. So it's a natural step for the Australian researchers to move into that space. There is also a growing support from the government in terms of how we can reinforce and strengthen our manufacturing capacities and capabilities in Australia, and part of that is promoting new fields like the one in cellular agriculture. So let's say that is a perfect condition right now for the growth and the generation of new companies jumping into the space of cellular agriculture.
Wow, yeah, it really sounds like Australia is and the government is really supportive, so it might actually rival Singapore as a new hotbed for CellX startups. Okay, let's move on to Ziliang. There has been a lot of excitement from the CellX field about China recently, and there was actually a recent announcement from the Chinese government about its next 5-year agriculture plan. And I think there was a bit of mention of alternative proteins. So what do you think that means for the future of cultured meat in the country, given this announcement by the Chinese government?
Yeah, I think that's a great news for for us all. I think I think for the past few years we have been out knowing that there will be support from the government, because this industry hits on two major government agenda from the central government. Number one is carbon neutrality. China has the goal to be carbon neutral by 2060, and to be I think that we all know agriculture plays a huge role in the carbon reduction. Number two is for food security, very similar to to what Mihir shared earlier about Singapore. China also has a very aggressive agenda for carbon for security as well. I think that's why cultivated meat actually fits perfectly with those two agendas that the government has. I think the mentioning in the 5-year plan and also the mentioning from President Xi, so I think will play a huge role in promoting the industry in China from both a private funding and also from a public funding, as well as more entrepreneurs going to the field. I think this will be a huge huge news for the field for us.
Okay, and what do you think the government interest in this field means for your startup moving forward? Like how it helps your startup specifically?
Yeah, I think specifically a couple of things. Number one is, I think there will be more funding, both from a public funding perspective, also from a private, VC perspective. More and more investors are actually very policy driven, and they will see this as a, as industry that will be supported by the government. So I think there will be more funding, both from a private but also from a public perspective. Number one. Number two, I think this will also serve as a as a guidance or a context when we talk about regulatory approval process. When we talk about having conversations with the relevant agency in China. I think this will be also serve as a as a starting point there as well. That's number two. Number three is, I think, more scientists and also more more students will obviously take this as a strong backing from the government, and they'll have more confidence coming into this industry. And I think lastly, this will also create more public debate. I think there will also be also help us with consumer education in China as well. I think that's the 4 aspects that will help us for this specifically for our company.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it sounds like it's actually something that's really helpful for your startup now that the government is also kind of supportive of this. Okay, so now I will move on to ask questions to all the panelists regarding regulation. So firstly, I'll ask Louis. So Singapore has led the way with the regulatory approval of cultivated meat. And do you think that there's any work being done for the regulatory approval of cultivated foods in Australia? And where do you think your cultivated human breast milk will fall in terms of this approval?
Well, there are already conversations right now discussing how it's going to be regulated, and this doesn't apply just to breast milk, but in general of those new products that are coming to the market. Pioneers on that discussions are companies that have been already working with the regulatory institutions like BAO and Nourish. I think for human breast milk, especially in our case where we are working on fortifiers, there's going to be a link between the G and also SAF. So it's going to be the borderline between pharmaceutical and food. But that's not going to be true for all the products. So things that are coming and going to the market of plain meat will be entirely regulated by the food industry. However, the Australian government is following closely to that example that Singapore is leading in terms of how to advance the regulatory framework to help to speed up the process between the research and development to actually hit the market.
Yeah, and do you think that you would envision setting up your first operations or sales in Australia or in another country?
So as a Australian-based company, we are focusing our efforts here in Australia, but I believe every company always think about expansion and looking at different markets outside of the regional country. That's also our case.
All right, so my next question is for Ziliang. Considering the Chinese government's interest in the field, when do you think we can expect regulatory approval in China? Are you aiming to launch in China first?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that's the million-dollar question that we're asking. And I think from my end, I think there is no question that it will be approved. I think the only question is when and how. I think there are two things that need to happen before this get approved in China. Number one is from our conversations with the regulatory agency, which is called CIPSA. They are the SFA counterpart if you look at Singapore for reference. And from our conversations with them, they are supportive of this new field, but very similar to all other new technologies in China. The authorities are more conservative, and they want to see more international adoption before approving in China. So I think a reasonable expectation is we want to see approval in the US, or potentially in the EU before approval in China. And that's why for CellX, we're also working very closely with countries such as Singapore or the US. To get approval first before getting approval in China. I think that's number one. Number two is I think for companies in China, there's also the need to actually be able to prove that what we are producing is safe, is mature, is consistent. I think that's the key criteria that the authority is looking at as well. So I think we'll be able to. I think what we need then is we actually be able to have the bioprocess system figured out and be able to produce in a more mature, consistent, and safe manner before we move on to the actual approval and also go to market piece of it.
Great, thank you for your answer. So Mihir, my question for you is, we've heard that a lot of CellX companies are considering setting up operations in Singapore due to the regulatory approval of cultivated meat. What are lessons that you think other countries can learn from Singapore? Oh, I think I muted.
I got it. Yeah, thanks. I think one of the key things for countries to learn from the successes and also the challenges Singapore has faced is that when you want to incentivize an industry, I think you have to try to create a framework that allows a good balance of safety and innovation to occur. I think Israel seems to be doing a pretty good job of this right now by sort of modulating and regulating what companies can do without selling product. So they're able to get feedback from consumers, they're able to demonstrate demand by kind of filling test facilities, for example, but it's not a full commercial approval per se, right? And I think we can maybe take some lessons from the way that we have emergency use authorizations in place for COVID, and a lot of governments have systems and frameworks in place to allow things in an emergency situation. I think creating an analog framework for innovation where you're able to create a test like a sandbox, right? Where it's a curated environment where you can get a preliminary validation of safety with maybe shorter term data and allow companies to produce in some quantity. It seems like an approach that would be well suited to balancing the interests of the government with the interests of the potential innovation sector. And I think Singapore is doing this pretty well in terms of how it's balancing what you can do for a sensory evaluation or what you can do for product demonstrations pre that full approval. And so the ability to balance the need for really thorough, rigorous analysis in a full market approval versus what can happen in the innovation stage, in the invention stage, seems to be matching something that companies can achieve in that development timeframe without being too onerous. And I think that's really critical because you want companies to be able to succeed, but you also want to make sure that they're following some level of standards that will eventually translate into that full market approval.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Yeah, I mean, definitely the government has a strong part to play in making regulations not onerous and like the process more straightforward for startups. It's really important. Okay, so now let's shift the conversation to talk about investments. So, I mean, the cellular agriculture ecosystem has been growing all around Asia, and investments have played a key role in maintaining that growth. At the same time, while companies all around the world are looking to Asia to launch, only 23% of the field's investments out of 4 billion are in Asia, and the rest are in like other parts of the world. So it's kind of like a smaller proportion of how much the potential in Asia could be. So I had a few questions for each of you. Let's start with Ziliang. Like, how China view this novel field of CellX, and what do you think can be done to further increase investor interest in this field?
Yeah, so I think right now, I think the field is still relatively new in China. For all the investors that I talk to, I think it's probably their first time talking to an alternative protein or a cultivated meats company. I think there's still a lot of work to be done to get investors more familiarized and more comfortable with this new industry. And so I think that's number one. There has to be a lot of more, investor education in that regard. Number one. Number two is I think companies in China or companies in Asia is also relatively early stage compared to the international competitors such as FMT or Upside. I think we're on average about 2-3 years, if not even more, behind in terms of timing. So I think there's also the need for companies in Asia, also for companies in China, to actually move further ahead in terms of R&D as well as bioprocess to actually prove that point of this is actually achievable from a both cost perspective, but also scaling up perspective. I think that's also lots of work to be done from that perspective. Number three is I think there also needs to be more conversation with the regulatory authorities to actually push forward the regulation. And that's why we actually had a first China Cellular Agriculture Forum just 2 weeks ago, where about 30 companies from both within China and also also international companies were able to join, and were able to discuss what are the best ways to work together and be able to establish a platform to actually serve as a way for companies to talk to the authorities and also for companies to come together and work together. I think that's also much needed for the industry as well.
Okay, cool. And for Mihir, how have investments become a key way for Singapore to position itself as a key food tech hub in the region? Are you seeing the same support for early stage startups in Singapore?
I think it's changing pretty rapidly. I would say coming from the US, where I worked in sort of the entrepreneurial space initially, I would say definitely the earliest stages, particularly the pre-seed and seed, are still definitely more risk averse than you would see in California, for example. But on the whole, I've seen a lot of movement toward more early stage investing and taking more of those early stage investments on faith on betting on team, right? When you don't have so much traction in sort of pre-seed sort of rounds and seed rounds. And I think that's going to continue to change. I think it's something that just takes time for investors to build comfort. And especially as the ecosystems mature, and Singapore seems to be maturing quite quickly, especially in the food tech space, that will become more and more of a virtuous cycle because you'll see founders exit and become angel investors again in the ecosystem. And I think that's really what it takes for an ecosystem to sort of fully mature. But for now, we're seeing, I think, more investors get comfortable with seeing investments that they would have liked to have made and saying, well, maybe I'll bet a little bit earlier this time because I missed it the last time. And so I think we're seeing more of that. We're also seeing more dedicated funds getting set up in Singapore around alternative protein, around food tech, some of which include fund managers also coming from overseas set up in Singapore. So that also definitely helps because they're bringing with them experience and mindsets that helped them to previously launch funds in other places. But I think the biggest challenge in general is not just one of being willing to invest early, but it's also that there's some fundamental differences that make investing in smaller geographic markets more challenging early on. Because in the US, for example, you could build quite a large company selling just within the US. In Singapore, you have to go outside of Singapore fairly early to reach enough consumers to get to that same size. And so you then have to look at a team and say, not only can they build this, but can they internationalize? Can they handle the additional challenges that come with that? So I think there are some legitimate reasons why it's a tougher early stage sort of proof point to demonstrate that you're going to be able to grow the business and make it work.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Especially in Southeast Asia. I mean, if you started from Singapore, it's such a small market that you definitely have to prove that you have the ability to launch in all the other parts of the region and like really be expanding. Yeah, unlike the US, which is just such a big market itself. So I that is a key challenge for some of the startups starting up, but hopefully it's something that they can, overcome. So now I'll ask Louis a question. How do Australian investors view this CellX field? Do you see that there is growing demand for alternatives to animal products, leading to more investor interest?
Definitely. In my experience, the investors are becoming more educated in terms of understanding the industry. And also, Mihir make a point on they know previous cases and they don't want to miss the opportunity to actually help to grow new ideas and new companies. So instead of becoming harder to pull an idea, what you find out is that you get a lot of feedback in terms of what is important to tackle in the early stages in order to succeed in the growth of the company. So it's a growing interest. Investors in Australia know about tech because biotech has been growing in the country for many, many years. And now they are understanding what is expected for the market of these new products in terms of cellular agriculture. So they understand the potential of the new ideas and the technological approaches. And now they are understanding the potential that we as a field have in terms of commercial growth and commercial application.
All right, great. So now I want to move on to talk about the topic of partnerships. Right? In the past few years, we've seen a lot of partnerships from CellX startups with both food and biotech companies in the APAC region. So Ziliang, I know that CellX recently announced a partnership with Blue Seafood in Germany. What does this partnership mean moving forward for your team? Do you envision that more startups will make partnerships with other startups from another region to expand globally?
Yes, I think what we are trying to solve is a global issue, and I think this needs a global solution. And I think the industry needs more collaboration between companies, especially companies who have a very complementary focus in terms of geography and also species focus. And I think for us, we are mostly based in China. We have a mammalian species focus, and I think Blue, they are both they're based in Europe, and they have a fish focus. I think this this is there's a natural there's a natural synergy between us. And And I think, this is a starting point for us. And I think, in the future, we want to have more deeper collaborations with Blue in terms of going to market, we're relatively, we're regulatory approval, or even, co-developing products. And I think we're also open to talk to more companies with a complementary focus, and establish more partnerships with them. I think this is partnership within the cultivated meat companies. I think beyond cultivated meat companies, there are also more collaborations with either upstream suppliers such as media companies, or bioreactor companies, or partnerships with downstream partners such as the large food and also meat companies. I think for us, we have also partnered with a couple of leading media bioreactor companies in China as our upstream partners, and we are also announcing a couple of other major partnership with downstream partners later this year as well.
Nice. Yeah, it's really great that you're making like so many different partnerships, and I love the collaborative approach that you're taking in expanding your startup. And I think really good move. So for Louis, do you also envision partnering with different food or biotech players to scale your production? And do you see that being complicated for your process of producing cell-derived dairy?
Well, we are early in our journey, but that's something that we already start pushing by contacting collaborators or different biotech companies in order to solve some of the challenges that we're going to face to escalate the process. So definitely, I agree with the two other speakers in terms of how important it is to establish these collaborations. This is establishing this production pipeline is not an easy task, and obviously one single company trying to solve every single problem will not be cost efficient. So as the ecosystem is maturing and most people is specializing in different aspects of the production, we'll find out that this kind of collaborations will be not a new thing, but more the rule for everyone to actually secure the success of their own companies. And not just collaborations directly with other companies in the space, but collaboration with companies in already established fields of technology, like pharma, that has been working in bioreactors and upscaling downstream and upstream processes for many years, and also companies that works in other industries like cell therapies that has already an understanding of how solve many of the problems that you are facing when you're trying to recreate tissues. For example, for my friends working in the field of cellular of clean meat, and also other people that has, for example, using precision fermentation to produce single ingredients when the pharma industry has been producing recombinant proteins for many years. So what we're gonna see in the future is that it's gonna be, that's my opinion, that kind of a blend between the two fields of biotechnology, where both of them benefits of existing technologies, and also all the work that we in the field are doing in terms of reduce the cost of production. So it's going to be a two-way win.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to hear that you see that there are many different ways that you can collaborate with the other players. So from here, from your perspective, what are the benefits of partnering with some of these other players in the ecosystem?
Yeah, well, I think fundamentally it's just a problem that's insurmountable by any one company alone. Even if we assume you could do all of the R&D in seafood, we're talking about 100 million tons of product that needs to get developed and cultivated and produced and distributed. I don't think any company in history has achieved that volume of food produced and moved. So I think we really have to think about how we fit into the larger ecosystem and how we can benefit from what's already in place to make it easier to bring product to consumers and also to accelerate adoption. So in some cases, that's upstream partners for us in terms of suppliers and in terms of maybe precision fermentation that can help us generate some of the inputs we need from others upstream. But I think for us, a lot of the focus right now is on downstream is looking at how we can work with traditional industry and their distribution, their existing networks to get the seafood that we're going to produce to consumers in restaurants and in other hospitality segments. And some of that is actually in product formation partnerships. Some of that is in distribution. But I think without those things, we're reinventing pieces of a large global set of infrastructure that's already been built. And we have enough challenges ahead of us that we shouldn't be trying to do that.
Cool. Thank you so much for your really insightful answer. So before we wrap up, I'm just going to ask some questions from the Q&A that the audience has asked. So one of the questions is, what are the specific challenges in the culturing and expansion of mammary gland epithelial cells, especially culturing them in bouillons using animal-free growth medium? So I think that might be for Louis.
Yes, I think that might be for me. Like any of the people working in the industry, what we are trying to is to utilize something that came from the tissue and put it in the context of an artificial environment to push grow endlessly. So just keep them growing and growing, and that means that one of the biggest challenges will be try to maintain the identity of the cells, so the cells behave, look, and are the same from the beginning, and that's a big challenge. Another challenge that is more specific for people working in the space of human breast milk is that actually our product is not the cells that we are growing, the product is what those cells produce. So that changed entirely how we approach upstream and downstream processes, okay? Because we are not focusing in the cells that we're growing, we're focusing in the media that the cells are growing into. So it requires a little bit of media development, and also the way we adapt existing technologies in terms of reactors in order to guarantee trying to simplify the purification of the media, the conditioned media, and the milk that is being produced by the cells.
Okay, thank you for your detailed explanation. We have another question, and I think it's also for you. From the regulatory perspectives, what do you think are the key challenges to be taken care of by founders when they're sourcing the mammalian cells of their startup?
Well, it's going to be different for those who are working with animal species to people like me that's working with human tissues. But what I think will be common is the focus on biosafety of the tissues that are being sourced, which obviously becomes critical when you are like in the case of us producing products that are intended to vulnerable populations like the babies, the preterm babies. But I believe applies to any other product that's going to be consumed massively by the public.
Yeah, happy to add on here. So from my experience of talking to regulators in different countries, there are two main things when we talk about the cell lines. Number one is where does the cell line come from, the cell extraction process. And then here are two things. Number one is they want to see the documentation in terms of where what's the animal, and in what condition was the animal being raised. Were there any testing on specific specific illness or or influenza for the animals, and that's documentation for where does the tissue come from. And I think number two is the protocol for how do you extract or how do you get the cells from the animal. I think that's for the first part. I think that's all about the extraction of things. Number two is around the cell itself. How do you prove it is stable over time? After 20 times or 30 times or even more, how do you prove that the cell is stable? I think there has to be more documentation and more testing on that as well. And that's the two major things that come up when we talk to regulators on the cell lines.
I think the only thing that I would add to that that we've seen as well is what you're doing to your cell lines as part of your process and how that might be influencing how they change compared to the cells that you took out, the primary cells that you harvested. So there are some companies that are taking GM approaches. There are some companies that are not taking GM approaches, but that are applying evolutionary pressure via mutagenesis or other things to increase genetic diversity in their cell lines to try to find a more rapid path to immortalization, for example. Depending on what you're doing, even if that's not gene editing in a legal sense, there are definitely questions that regulators have around how those processes change the expression of genes and perhaps how the mutations might affect food safety compared to what you find in the wild or the farmed animal.
Yeah, okay, thank you all the speakers for answering the questions by the audience. So now to wrap up, I'll just ask two final questions. So my first question is, what are your plans moving forward into 2020? Seeing how the field has grown in 2021, what do you believe is going to happen moving forward this year for the field in APAC? You can jump in to answer.
Yeah, so I think for us, the key plans right now are continuing to develop our scale up our system and also develop better scale down models that allow us to do higher throughput screening to really optimize more efficiently as we move toward scaling, and to secure additional partnerships on the downstream side. So looking at producing various product forms that showcase the versatility of what we can do, and then sort of finding the right fit commercially for those products with a partner. I think those are kind of the key milestones for us this year, as well as progressing our scale up to kind of still pre-pilot phase, but getting to where we start to really understand how the bioprocess conditions will look as we scale up, so that we can model those and try to really optimize those. And I think in terms of where we might see things go this year and maybe into next year, I think ecosystem has been red hot, right? There's been tons of funding coming in, loads of new companies getting started. I think that will probably continue for a time, but I think we'll likely start to see some consolidation as some of the larger players look to diversify. So especially if they're able to commercialize first products this year, they may start to look at how they can sort of inorganically bring on additional new products into their organization. And so we've already kind of seen a few of these, but we may see more companies at the earlier stages getting picked up by some of the large companies to help them add a new species or a new product line to their portfolio.
Yeah, for our company, we are heading to a growth stage where we increase the number of people involved in the team, and we refine our prototype in order to move into the upscaling of the process. In terms of the field, I believe we are going to see the emerge of new early followers for all the companies, and a lot of more creativity in terms of the new products. Essentially, we have divided most of the companies in the clean meat industry are working around the concept of different species, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the products that are producing, and they're going to try to recapitulate all the variety of food options that you can see out there. So that is actually very exciting in terms of how the development of the final product rather than the new technologies is going to play and is going to actually guarantee the success in terms of commercialization, that actually the products are sold, that products are accepted by the public, and the products are going to be consumed in large scale.
So I think there are actually 3 stages of R&D development. Number 1 is the fundamental pieces, such as the cell lines, the media, the scaffolds, all the fundamental things. That's number 1 step. Number 2 is once you have all of those laid out, you move on the scaling up piece of it, which means you figure out, by this point you figure out, what's the best way to actually make a small piece of meat. But the next piece is, I think it's all about making tons of it at a low cost and also in a consistent manner. I think that's the number 2 stage. And the last stage is getting approval and also going to market. And I think for us, our major focus this year is going to be on the second phase of things, which is all about how do we produce in a more consistent manner that is also safe, that is also low cost, that is also in large scale. And that's where we are. For the overall industry, I expect to see more companies, especially the companies in the US or we're in Israel, going to the last phase, which is getting approval and also going to market. I think I expect to see a couple of approvals in the US market this year. I think that's my thoughts on this.
All right. Okay. I think that's all the time we have for questions. And I just really want to thank all the speakers for giving really detailed and insightful answers for all the questions. And I think you've provided a lot of, valuable knowledge for their participants. So now I'm going to pass on the time back to Amit to wrap up and close the session. Thank you.